Here's something historians have known for decades, but almost nobody talks about. The word that defined an entire era of terror, Viking, was only used by one group of people at the time. Not the French, not the Irish, not the monks who watched their monasteries burn. Only the English used it, and even they used it rarely. Everyone else had different names for the same people: Northmen, Danes, pagans, foreigners. The word Viking, the one we plaster across movies, tattoos and football helmets, was barely a word at all for most of the people who actually lived through the age it supposedly defines. That small, strange fact is the doorway into everything you think you know about the Vikings being wrong. And by the time this story ends, all the way through the burning of monasteries, the siege of Paris, the conquest of England, the discovery of America, and the night a Viking king's empire stretched from the North Sea to the edge of the known world, you'll understand why the real Vikings were far more interesting, far more complicated, and far more consequential than the raiders with horned helmets your history class gave you. By the way, they didn't wear horned helmets. That came from a costume designer in the 19th century. The Vikings would have found that hilarious. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the raids, but the beginning of the world that made the raids inevitable. Chapter 1. The world before the storm. Who were the Vikings, really? Picture Scandinavia in the early 8th century. Not as a region of ice and myth, but as a place very much alive with trade, politics, and ambition. The three territories that would one day become Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were not yet nations. They were collections of chieftains, petty kings, and powerful families, constantly jostling for land, loyalty, and silver. There was no single Scandinavian identity. A man from the fjords of western Norway had as much in common with a trader from the Baltic coast of what is now Sweden as a Texan has with a New Yorker. Similar language, overlapping culture, but very different worlds. What united them was the sea. The Scandinavians were not uniquely violent. They were not biologically more aggressive than anyone else in 8th century Europe. What made them different, what made the next 3 centuries theirs, was a combination of technology, geography, and timing that came together in a way nobody saw coming. The technology was the ship. The geography was a coastline so jagged, so filled with narrow fjords and scattered islands that you either mastered the water or you didn't survive. Scandinavian children grew up on boats. They read currents the way other people read faces. By the time a young man from a coastal Norwegian village was in his 20s, he understood the North Sea in a way that the most experienced English or Frankish sailor simply didn't. The sea was not an obstacle. It was a road. The timing was everything. Here's the cause that most history books skim over. The raids didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because, for roughly a century before the first documented Viking attack, the economy of northwestern Europe had been quietly exploding. Trade routes were expanding. New commercial centres, proto-cities, really, had grown up at key river mouths and coastal points. Places like Dorestad on the Rhine, Quentovich near Boulogne, Hamwick in southern England, and the growing markets of London and York. These weren't just trading posts, they were concentrations of wealth. Silver, cloth, wine, luxury goods, all flowing in and out, accumulating in monasteries, in the treasuries of nobles, in the storehouses of merchants. The Scandinavians knew. They had been trading at the edges of this system for years. Scandinavian merchants regularly travelled to Frankish markets. They understood the layout of the rivers. They knew which monasteries were isolated, which towns had no walls, which coastlines had no patrol. They didn't arrive as ignorant pirates stumbling onto a lucky target. They arrived as men who had done the reconnaissance. And they arrived because someone back home was pushing them out. Let's spend a moment on a question that sounds simple but isn't. Why did the Vikings leave? The romantic answer is wanderlust, the spirit of adventure, the call of the horizon. That's a good story, and it sells television series. The real answer is more political, more uncomfortable, and more human. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was in the middle of a political consolidation. Stronger kings, especially in Denmark, were extending their power over neighbouring chieftains. Some of those chieftains submitted, some were absorbed, and some refused. For the ones who refused, leaving wasn't just an option, it was often the only alternative to submission or death. These were men with followers to feed, reputations to maintain, and no intention of bowing to a Danish king who had decided their territory now belonged to him. They needed silver. They needed plunder. They needed a place where their skills, fighting, sailing, leading men, would make them powerful again. The name Viking itself may actually come from Viken, a coastal region around the Oslo fjord, heavily pressed by Danish royal expansion. If that's true, the very word we use to describe an entire civilization might originally have meant nothing more than refugee. There's a certain painful irony in that. The terrifying invaders of Europe's imagination began, at least partly, as men running from someone else's empire. One more thing to understand before the storm begins: the Vikings were never a unified force. When Norwegian ships hit the monasteries of northern Britain, they were not coordinating with Danish fleets raiding the Frankish coast. When Swedish merchants, the people Slavic tribes called the Rus, giving Russia its very name, were pushing deep into Eastern Europe along river trade routes, they were operating in an entirely different world from the warriors laying siege to Paris. The Vikings were not an army. They were not a movement. They were dozens, eventually hundreds, of independent bands, some small family groups, some massive military forces, each operating according to their own logic, their own leaders, their own calculations of risk and reward. What they shared was the ship. What they shared was the sea. What they shared was the dangerous combination of skill, desperation, and opportunity that, in the right historical moment, becomes something history cannot ignore. That moment was about to arrive. In 793, on a small island off the coast of Northumbria, in northeastern England, a group of Norwegian raiders beached their ships, walked up to the monastery of Lindisfarne, and changed the world. Not because the attack was uniquely brutal, frankly. Christian kings of the same era did comparable things to each other all the time. Not because the monks of Lindisfarne were the first victims of seaborne violence in history, but because of what the attack represented, the opening of a seam in the defences of Christian Europe that, once opened, could not be closed for nearly 300 years. The monks called them pagans, the scholars called them agents of God's punishment for Christian sin, the kings called them a problem. They were all right, in their own way, but none of them understood, yet, just how big the problem was going to get. Chapter 2. Fire and Silver. The Age of Raids begins. Imagine you are a monk at Lindisfarne in the summer of 793. Your world is small, deliberate, and beautiful. The island sits just off the Northumbrian coast, close enough to the mainland to feel connected, far enough to feel apart. The monastery has stood here for over a century. The monks grow their food, copy their manuscripts, pray their hours. The most dangerous thing in your life is the cold. The sea around you is not a threat. It is a moat. It is protection. And then, one June morning, the ships appear on the horizon. They move fast, faster than anything you've seen, and the men who step off them don't come to trade. The attack on Lindisfarne lasted hours. The monks who survived described it as something outside the natural order, a punishment from God, a sign of apocalypse. The raiders killed some, captured others, threw some into the sea, stripped the church of everything valuable, and left. What they left behind was more powerful than anything they took. They left behind fear, and fear, in the political world of 8th century Europe, was a form of currency more valuable than gold. The attack itself was not unprecedented in its violence. Kings and warlords had been burning monasteries, stealing church treasure, and killing clergy for centuries. Christian rulers did it to their enemies. Sometimes they did it to their own people. Violence against sacred places was not invented in 793. What was different was where the attackers came from. They came from the sea. They came from outside the known system of politics, alliances, and retaliation that governed how European kingdoms dealt with threats. You couldn't negotiate with them the way you negotiated with a neighbouring king. You couldn't send an embassy. You couldn't threaten their territory because their territory was the open water and nobody had a navy capable of following them home. The scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the Frankish court of Charlemagne, captured the shock of the moment with the kind of words a man uses when the world stops making sense. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. He was right that it was new. He was wrong that it was the last. Within 2 years, the Vikings had struck Jarrow, another Northumbrian monastery. They hit Skye and the island of Iona off the western coast of Scotland. They raided Rathlin Island off the northeast coast of Ireland. By 799, they had crossed the open water to the European continent and struck a monastery on an island at the mouth of the Loire River in what is now France. The pattern was clear, even if no one could see the full shape of it yet. The monasteries were not random targets. They were the logical ones. They were isolated. They were wealthy. They were full of silver and gold religious objects, jewelled manuscripts, embroidered cloth. They were staffed by unarmed men who had devoted their lives to non-violence. And crucially, they were almost always built near water. The same rivers that made monasteries spiritually significant, the same coastlines that made them feel close to God, were the same routes the Viking ships could navigate with ease. The Vikings had not stumbled onto a weakness. They had identified one. Here is something that often gets lost in the drama of burning buildings and terrified monks. The early Viking raids were not acts of random destruction. They were economic operations. Think about what a raid required. You needed ships, expensive, carefully built vessels that took skilled craftsmen months to complete. You needed crews, men who had to be fed, paid, and led with some credibility. You needed information. Which monasteries were worth hitting? Which coastlines had patrols? Which river mouths were navigable? You needed timing. Raids happened in summer, when the seas were manageable and the days were long. This was not the behaviour of savages acting on impulse. This was calculated risk management. And the returns, when a raid worked, were extraordinary. A single, successful monastery raid could yield more silver than a Scandinavian farmer would see in a lifetime. Jewelled reliquaries, the ornate containers monks used to store the bones of saints, were essentially portable treasure chests. Church plate, vestments woven with gold thread, ivory carvings, illuminated manuscripts bound in gem-studded covers. All of it could be stripped, loaded onto a ship, and carried home to be melted down, sold, or displayed as symbols of a chieftain's power. And then there was the human cargo. Captives were valuable. Not in every context. The economics of enslaving someone depended on what you could actually do with them afterward. But in the emerging Viking network, captives could be sold to Muslim traders in Spain or North Africa, who in turn moved them into markets stretching as far as the Middle East. The Irish monasteries, which had less gold and silver than their English or Frankish counterparts, were particularly targeted for their human inhabitants rather than their treasure. The violence was horrific, but it was not random. It followed a logic. Of all the places the early Vikings struck, Ireland was where they first understood that raiding was not enough. The Irish monasteries were rich in a different currency: manuscripts, prestige, spiritual authority. But Ireland itself was politically fragmented in ways that created both vulnerability and opportunity. There was no unified Irish kingdom. There were dozens of regional kings, constantly at war with each other, making alliances and breaking them with the flexibility of men who had been doing it for centuries. The Vikings initially raided the coastlines, then they went deeper. By 836, they were hitting monasteries in the Irish interior. By 840, they were doing something nobody had expected. They were staying. The Viking Longfort, the fortified harbour base, essentially a winter camp from which raids could be launched in all directions, was an innovation with enormous consequences. Once a Viking force stopped moving and started occupying, the entire logic of Irish defence changed. You could not simply wait for the raiders to leave. They weren't leaving. Dublin, established as a fortified Viking base around 841, would eventually become one of the most important trading cities in medieval Europe. But in those early years, it was something simpler and more dangerous. A permanent beachhead on Irish soil, a statement that the people who had come from the sea intended to remain. The Irish found themselves fighting not a raid but an occupation. And the Vikings who occupied Ireland found themselves pulled, slowly but inevitably, into Irish politics, forming alliances with local kings, fighting other Irish kings, sometimes fighting each other when Norwegian and Danish interests collided in the cramped geography of the Irish Sea. This was not the clean, sharp story of raiders versus victims. This was the beginning of something messier and more permanent. By the 832, the nature of the Viking threat had evolved beyond anything the first generation of raiders had represented. The raids were bigger. Where the earliest attacks had involved a handful of ships, the fleets of the 830s numbered dozens of vessels. The attack on Dorestad, the great Frankish trading centre at the mouth of the Rhine, the beating heart of North Sea commerce, happened 4 years in a row, starting in 834. Each time, the attackers came back. Each time, the damage was worse. The raids were deeper. Where the first generation had struck coastlines and island monasteries and retreated immediately, the new raiders moved up rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames. These were not casual coastal strikes. These were deliberate penetrations of the interior, targeting the concentrated wealth of major monasteries, noble estates, and emerging towns. And the raids were coordinated in ways that suggest a level of intelligence gathering that should be uncomfortable to think about. Someone was telling the Viking leaders which targets were worth hitting, where the defences were weakest, when the local rulers were distracted by internal politics. The Scandinavian merchant network, which had been operating peacefully in the same European markets for decades, had given Viking raiders a detailed map of Europe's wealth before the first ship was armed. The kingdoms of Western Europe were not unprepared for war. They had armies, they had cavalry, they had fortified cities. What they had never needed to prepare for was an enemy who appeared from the sea without warning, struck with overwhelming speed, and vanished before a response could be organised. The entire military architecture of the Frankish Empire and the English kingdoms was designed for land warfare. Against a seaborne enemy who could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline and be gone within hours, it was nearly useless. The 9th century was about to demonstrate, in the most brutal possible way, what happens when a civilization's defences are built for the war it fought last time. Something interesting happens in the historical record by the late 830s. Alongside the stories of raids and burnings, you start finding something else: deals. Frankish kings paying off Viking leaders, Irish kings forming alliances with Viking chieftains against rival Irish kings, English rulers negotiating with Viking commanders for temporary peace. On the surface, these look like weakness, and sometimes they were, but they also reflect something more sophisticated. The people on the receiving end of the raids were beginning to understand that the men attacking them were not simply destroyers, they were bargaining agents. They wanted specific things: silver, territory, trade rights, legitimacy, and if you could give them those things, they would, at least temporarily, stop burning your monasteries. This realization, that the Vikings could be negotiated with, incorporated, even used, would eventually produce some of the most consequential political arrangements in medieval history. The Duchy of Normandy, the Danelaw in England, the ruling dynasty of Russia. All of these began as accommodations between terrified kingdoms and opportunistic raiders, but before the accommodation came the storm. And the storm, in the second half of the 9th century, was about to become something no one in Western Europe had ever seen before: a full-scale military invasion with the explicit goal of permanent conquest. The age of raids was ending. The age of empires was about to begin. Chapter 3. Burning Charlemagne's Dream, the Vikings versus the Frankish Empire. There is a particular kind of tragedy that history loves to repeat. The greatest empire of its age, built by a genius over decades of war and diplomacy, handed to sons who cannot hold it together, and then watched by hungry outsiders who understand exactly what the cracks in the foundation mean. Charlemagne spent 50 years building the Frankish Empire. He conquered the Saxons. He subdued the Lombards. He received a crown from the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800, becoming, in theory, the first emperor of the West since Rome fell. The Frankish realm stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now France and Spain, all the way to the edges of Central Europe. It was the most powerful political structure in the Western world. He also spent those 50 years worrying about the Vikings. There is a story, probably embellished, but too good to dismiss entirely, that Charlemagne once stood at the window of a coastal town and watched a Viking fleet on the horizon. The fleet didn't attack that day. They saw the emperor's forces and turned away. But Charlemagne reportedly wept, not from fear, but from foresight. He looked at his nobles standing around him, confused by his tears, and said something to the effect of, "I am not weeping for myself. I weep because I know that while I live, these men will not harm this shore. But after I am gone, what will they do to my sons and their people?" He died in 814. Within 30 years, his fears had become prophecy. The problem was not that Charlemagne's sons were incompetent. His son Louis, later called the Pious, was a serious ruler who genuinely tried to maintain his father's legacy. The problem was structural. The Frankish Empire was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on the personal authority of a single exceptional ruler to survive intact across a succession. Louis had 3 sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles, later nicknamed the Bold. Each believed he was the rightful heir to the largest possible share of his grandfather's empire. Each had enough support among the Frankish nobility to back that claim with force, and each, at various points in the 830s and 840s, was willing to tear the empire apart to prove it. The civil wars that followed Louis's death in 840 were devastating, not because of their immediate military consequences, but because of what they signalled to the people watching from the north. The Viking leaders were not unsophisticated observers of Frankish politics. Through decades of trading, raiding, and negotiating with Frankish officials, they had developed an intimate understanding of how the empire worked, where its wealth was concentrated, and, critically, how its defence functioned. And what they now saw was an empire so consumed by its own internal collapse that the men responsible for coastal defence were either fighting each other or looking the other way. It was, to put it simply, the opportunity of a generation. To understand what happened next, you need to think about the Frankish Empire not as a political map, but as a hydraulic system. The great rivers of what is now France, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Garonne, were not just geographic features. They were the arteries of the empire's economy. Goods flowed down them to the coast for export. Silver flowed up them from the trading centres. The richest monasteries in Christendom, Saint-Denis, Saint-Vendrille, Noirmoutier, Jumièges, were built along these rivers because the rivers gave them access to the world. Pilgrims came by river. Merchants came by river. Supplies came by river. And now, so did the Vikings. A Viking longship required only a metre of depth to navigate. These vessels could travel up rivers that Frankish defenders assumed were simply too shallow or too narrow to be strategic concerns. They could move against the current with oars when the wind failed. They could be dragged overland between river systems. They were, for their era, the most flexible military transport ever built, and the Frankish Empire had built its entire defensive architecture around the assumption that serious threats came overland. Once a Viking fleet entered the mouth of the Seine in 841 and pulled up to the monastery of Saint-Vendrille, the game had changed. This wasn't a coastal raid. This was a penetration 60 miles into the interior of the richest kingdom in Europe. The Frankish army, designed to respond to cavalry and infantry advancing across flat ground, had no doctrine for this. No contingency, no response, prepared. The story of what the Vikings did to the Frankish Empire over the following decades is, in one sense, a simple story of escalating exploitation, but it is also a story about the strange economics of protection and tribute that turned the Viking threat into a self-sustaining machine. Here is the mechanism. A Viking fleet arrives. A city or monastery pays silver to make them leave. The Vikings leave. They tell other Viking leaders how much silver the city has. More Vikings arrive. More silver is demanded. The city, having already paid once, knows from experience that payment works faster than resistance, so it pays again. This is the logic of the protection racket, and it was operating on a continental scale by the 840s. The payment made to save Paris in 845 is the number that stops modern historians mid-sentence, £7,000 of silver. To put that in perspective, a labouring man in 9th century Europe might earn the equivalent of a few pounds of silver in a year. £7,000, assembled in a matter of weeks, stripped from monasteries and noble treasuries across the Frankish realm, handed over on the banks of the Seine to a Viking leader named Ragnar. If this is indeed the same Ragnar who has since accumulated an entire mythology, to persuade him and his 120 ships to go away. He went away. For a while, and other Vikings, learning what Paris was worth, began to think about going there themselves. What the tribute payments created was not peace. What they created was an advertisement. Every time a Frankish king opened his treasury to buy off a Viking fleet, he was broadcasting to every ambitious chieftain in Scandinavia that here, in this soft and wealthy empire, there was silver to be taken with relatively low risk. The raids didn't stop because tribute was paid. The raids multiplied because tribute was paid. The logic was flawless, and the consequences were catastrophic. Numbers are useful, stories are necessary. Let us follow the monks of St. Philibert's monastery on the island of Noirmoutier, at the mouth of the Loire, because their story captures what it actually meant to live through 3 decades of Viking pressure in the Frankish Empire. The monastery had been founded on this small Atlantic island because islands felt safe. In the early 9th century, that instinct was still basically correct. When the first Viking raids began targeting the Loire coast, the monks developed a system. Each summer, when the raiding season arrived, they would pack their most precious possessions, the relics of their founder St. Philibert, the monastery's manuscripts and silver, onto boats and move to the mainland. When the threat passed, they'd return. For years this worked. It was exhausting, disruptive and humiliating. But it worked. Then the Vikings stopped leaving. By the 840s, Viking forces were wintering on Noirmoutier, using it as a permanent base for raids up the Loire. The monks could no longer return in autumn because the island was no longer theirs in autumn. They began a journey that would last decades, moving their saints' relics from monastery to monastery across the Frankish interior, always one step ahead of the raiding season, always guests rather than hosts. They finally stopped in Burgundy in 875, more than 600 miles from the island where St. Philibert had first built his chapel. The physical building they had left behind was gone, but the community survived, the relics survived, the books survived. This was not a story of total destruction. It was a story of something more complicated, more human, and in its own way more revealing. A civilization learning, at enormous cost, how to be mobile, how to protect what mattered, how to endure. By the 850/ and 860/, the Vikings had graduated from opportunistic raiders to something that functioned, for practical purposes, as a permanent military presence in the Frankish heartland. The Seine Valley, what one 9th century Frankish writer had called Charles's Paradise, the richest and most productive core of the Western Kingdom, was under continuous pressure. Viking forces overwintered in the river. They used islands in the Seine as fortified bases from which they could strike in any direction. They pushed further and further upstream each year, reaching Meaux in 862, Melun in 866. King Charles the Bald, who had inherited the western portion of the fragmented empire, was not an incompetent ruler. He understood the problem. He tried multiple responses. He paid tribute, repeatedly, and at enormous cost. He attempted to hire one Viking force to defend against another, which occasionally worked and more often made things worse. He began a systematic program of fortified bridge construction, attempting to physically block Viking ships from moving up the rivers. The bridge at Pont de l'Arche, built between 862 and 866, was a genuine engineering achievement, a fortified crossing designed to stop exactly the kind of riverine mobility that made the Viking threat so difficult to counter. It worked, for a while, in that specific location, but the empire had thousands of miles of navigable rivers. Charles could not bridge them all. The bishops and abbots of Normandy, the northwestern region most exposed to Viking pressure, effectively ceased to function as an organised church for decades. The Bishop of Coutances fled to Rouen. The Bishop of Nantes abandoned his see entirely. We have records suggesting that for a substantial period after the 870s, several major Norman dioceses had no bishop at all. The institutional church in what would become Normandy essentially collapsed under sustained Viking pressure. And then came 885, the year the Vikings decided Paris itself wasn't a city to be paid off. It was a city to be taken. The Viking fleet that appeared on the Seine in the autumn of 885 was the largest force yet assembled against a Frankish target. Contemporary accounts suggest somewhere between 700 and 800 ships, though medieval chroniclers were prone to exaggeration. Even accounting for inflation, this was clearly a force of several thousand men. Their target was Paris. Not to raid it, to occupy it, to use it as a base for pushing deeper into the Frankish interior, and very likely to extract tribute on a scale that would have made the 845 payment look like a rounding error. What they encountered was a defence organised by 2 men, Odo, Count of Paris, and Bishop Goslin. Between them, they had turned Paris, a relatively small city on an island in the Seine, into a fortified position with genuine defensive depth. The towers at each end of the bridges across the river were reinforced. The walls were manned. The garrison, though outnumbered, was prepared to fight. The siege lasted nearly a year. The Vikings tried everything: direct assault, mining the bridge foundations, flooding the river, with burning ships to destroy the bridges, plague and famine inside the walls, raids into the surrounding countryside to cut off supplies. The defenders held, repeatedly beating back attacks with a combination of courage, ingenuity, and the kind of desperate determination that comes when you have nowhere to retreat to. Eventually, the Emperor Charles the Fat, who had inherited nominal control of the reunited Frankish realm, arrived with an army. What he did with it would define his historical reputation forever. Rather than attack the besieging Vikings and drive them off, he negotiated. He paid them off. He allowed them to travel further up the Seine into Burgundy to continue raiding, in exchange for their agreement to eventually leave. The Parisians, who had held their city through nearly a year of siege, watched the emperor grant the people who had been trying to kill them permission to continue their journey upriver. The bitterness in the contemporary sources is palpable. Charles the Fat was deposed within a year. Odo of Paris, the man who had actually organised the defence, was elected king of the West Franks in 888. It was a signal moment. The age when Carolingian dynasties could be handed kingdoms by blood right alone was ending. Power was gravitating toward the men who could actually protect people. The Viking assault on the Frankish Empire did not end with a great battle or a decisive political settlement. It ended, as these things often do, with exhaustion on both sides and a deal that nobody was entirely happy with. Around 911, the West Frankish king Charles the Simple, whose nickname, in the original, Fiver, Doppie, meant something closer to straightforward than stupid, though later events would blur that distinction, reached an agreement with a Viking leader named Rollo. Rollo and his forces had been operating in the Seine Valley for years. They were not going home. They could not be driven out. And they could, potentially, be useful. The deal was this: Rollo would receive the land around Rouen, in the lower Seine Valley, as his territory. In exchange, he would defend it against other Viking incursions. He would accept baptism as a Christian. He would acknowledge the Frankish king as his nominal superior. Rollo agreed. He was baptized. He reportedly kissed the king's foot so awkwardly, according to a famous and possibly invented story, that he knocked the king backwards. The territory that Rollo received would eventually be called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo's descendants would rule it for generations, absorbing the Frankish language and culture with a thoroughness that, within a century, would make them more French than the French in many respects. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson would, in 1066, become the man we know as William the Conqueror. The Viking attack on the Frankish Empire never achieved its maximum ambition. No Viking king ever sat on a Frankish throne, but the empire that Charlemagne had built was never the same again. It had been fragmented by civil war, bled by tribute payments, and reshaped by the constant pressure of a threat it could contain, but never fully defeat. And out of that reshaping grew something new: the feudal kingdoms of medieval France, the fortified bridge as a tool of territorial control, the transformation of the church from a settled institution into a mobile, adaptive one, and a small, fiercely defended duchy on the Seine, ruled by the descendants of the men who had once burned it. History is full of ironies, but few are quite this precise. Chapter 4. The Great Heathen Army: How Vikings Almost Erased England. There is a detail in the historical record of 865 that most people walk straight past without stopping. A Viking army landed in East Anglia, the eastern coastal region of England, and the local king immediately made peace with them. He gave them horses. He let them winter on his land. He asked nothing in return except that they not burn his kingdom. They didn't burn his kingdom that year. 2 years later, they came back, killed him, and seized his territory. According to later tradition, the king, Edmund of East Anglia, later venerated as a saint, was captured, tied to a tree, and shot with arrows until he looked, the chroniclers said, like a hedgehog. Whether or not that specific detail is accurate, what is beyond dispute is this: within 5 years of landing on English soil, the force that contemporary writers called the Missile here, the Great Army, had destroyed 2 of England's 4 kingdoms, crippled a third, and reduced the entire political geography of the country to a single desperate question: could anyone stop them? To understand what the Great Army walked into, you need to understand what England was. and wasn't, in the middle of the 9th century. There was no England, strictly speaking. There were 4 kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. They shared a language, a religion, and a general cultural identity as Anglo-Saxons. They did not share a king, a treasury, a military command structure, or any reliable mechanism for coordinating a response to a shared threat. This mattered enormously when the Great Army arrived. Each kingdom faced the Viking threat essentially alone. What happened in Northumbria was Northumbria's problem. What happened in East Anglia was East Anglia's problem. The kings of Mercia and Wessex watched their neighbours fall without grasping, or at least without acting on the understanding that they were next. The fragmentation that had made England's political culture so resilient in some contexts, so full of local identity and regional character, became its fatal weakness when a single highly mobile military force could pick the kingdoms off one by one. The Great Army understood this perfectly. The contemporary sources call the force that landed in 865 a Mysel here, literally a great raiding army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary English source for this period, uses this term to distinguish the Great Army from the smaller raiding parties that had been hitting English coastlines since the late 8th century. Something was different about this force, and the English writers knew it. What was different was purpose. The earlier raiders wanted silver. They wanted to load their ships with portable wealth and carry it home. The Great Army wanted land. It wanted territory. It wanted to carve out kingdoms in England the way a carpenter carves a joint, precisely, deliberately, with a clear end product in mind. The leaders of the Great Army were men of substantial ambition and political sophistication. Their names come down to us through sources of varying reliability. Halfdan, Ivar, the man later called the Boneless, a nickname whose meaning has been debated for centuries, and Ubba. Whether these men were genuinely the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, as later saga tradition claims, is impossible to verify. What is clear from their conduct is that they were not acting impulsively. They were executing a strategy. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use mobility to prevent the English kingdoms from combining against them. Strike each kingdom at the moment of its maximum internal vulnerability, and convert military victory into political control as quickly as possible. It worked with a thoroughness that should have been impossible. Northumbria, the first target, handed the Vikings their opportunity with almost theatrical timing. The kingdom was in the middle of a civil war. 2 rival claimants, Ella and Osbert, were fighting each other for the throne when the Great Army seized York in November 866. York, the old Roman city of Eboracum, was the economic and political centre of the north of England. It sat astride the River Ouse, easily accessible by ship from the Humber estuary. Taking it required military competence. Holding it required political intelligence. The Great Army demonstrated both. The 2 warring Northumbrian kings made the belated decision to stop fighting each other and combine against the invaders. In March 867, they attacked York. They broke through the city walls. And then, in circumstances the sources describe but don't fully explain, the attack collapsed. Both kings were killed. The Northumbrian nobility that survived the battle capitulated. The Great Army installed a puppet king, took hostages, and extracted tribute. Northumbria as an independent kingdom had effectively ceased to exist, though it would stumble on in a diminished form for several more decades. The Great Army then turned south. East Anglia fell, its king killed in the manner described above, its nobility either dead or absorbed. Mercia was next. The Great Army wintered in Nottingham in 868, forcing the Mercian king to buy them off with what was becoming the familiar currency of English political humiliation. The kingdom survived that encounter, but barely, and only by trading its treasury for a temporary respite. 3 kingdoms down, 1 to go. Wessex was different, not because the West Saxon kingdom was inherently stronger than the others, though it had certain geographic advantages. The south coast was harder to approach from the sea than the east coast, and the kingdom had more defensible terrain. Wessex was different because, in the crucial years of the Viking assault, it had better leadership. The story of Alfred of Wessex is one of those historical stories that sounds like it was invented, the kind of tale where a hero is reduced to his lowest possible point and then, somehow, finds a way back. Except it actually happened. The Great Army turned its full attention to Wessex in 870. The kingdom fought battle after battle, 9 major engagements in a single year. By one count, Alfred's older brother Ethelred was king, and Alfred fought beside him. They won some battles, they lost others. Ethelred died in April 871, possibly from wounds sustained in battle, possibly from illness exacerbated by campaigning. Alfred, barely in his early 20s, became king in the middle of an ongoing invasion. He bought time. He paid tribute. He watched the Great Army turn its attention back to Northumbria and Mercia for several years, consolidating what it had won, beginning the process of distributing land to its followers and transforming from a conquering army into a governing force. Then, in the winter of 878, the blow fell. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Wessex in January, the middle of winter, when no one campaigned, when the roads were mud, when the idea of a major military offensive was simply outside the frame of expectation. He seized Chippenham, a royal estate in the heart of Wessex. The West Saxon nobility scattered. Many submitted. Many fled abroad. Alfred fled into the Somerset marshes with a small band of followers. This is the moment the legendary story of Alfred and the burnt cakes comes from. The humiliated king, hiding in a peasant's cottage, failing to watch some bread on a fire while his mind was elsewhere, being scolded by a woman who didn't know she was talking to a king. The story is almost certainly invented or heavily embellished. But it endures because it captures something true. This was Alfred's lowest point, a king in hiding. His kingdom apparently gone. The last Anglo-Saxon royal line seemingly on the verge of extinction. He spent the winter in the marshes, building a small fortification on the island of Athelney, sending messengers through the flooded landscape to the remaining loyal nobles, quietly, carefully, assembling the pieces of a counterattack. In the spring of 878, he emerged from the marshes. The Battle of Edington in May, 878, is one of those engagements that history records somewhat tersely. The sources tell us that Alfred's assembled force met Guthrum's army and defeated it, that the Vikings fled to their fortified position, that Alfred besieged them for 2 weeks until they surrendered. The details are sparse, the consequences were not. Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather, a ritual that transformed the Viking leader, at least formally, from a pagan enemy into something closer to a client king. He agreed to withdraw from Wessex. He and his forces eventually settled in East Anglia, which Guthrum ruled until his death in 890. Alfred had not expelled the Vikings from England. Half the country, the region that would later be called the Danelaw, stretching across the north and east, remained under Scandinavian control, but he had saved Wessex. He had established that the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom could resist and survive. What he did next was almost more important than the victory itself. Alfred understood something that none of his predecessors had grasped fully enough. Military victory was temporary. The Vikings would come back, different Vikings, new fleets, fresh ambitions. Unless Wessex became genuinely difficult to conquer, that required not just an army but an entire restructuring of the kingdom's defensive infrastructure. The Burgle system was Alfred's answer. Across Wessex, he established a network of fortified towns, burhs, positioned so that no point in the kingdom was more than a day's march from a defended position. These were not just military installations, they were economic centres, administrative nodes, places where trade could happen and royal authority could be exercised. The burhs transformed Wessex from a kingdom that reacted to Viking attacks into one that could absorb them, because by the time a Viking force reached a target, there was always a defended position between them and their objective. Alfred also built ships. This was conceptually radical. English kings had not previously invested seriously in naval capacity, because the strategic logic of land warfare didn't require it. Alfred grasped what the Vikings had demonstrated for decades. Control of the sea approaches was the only way to prevent the next great army from landing at will. His ships were reportedly larger than Viking longships, designed for open water interception rather than riverine raids. Whether they were entirely successful in technical terms is debated. What matters is the thinking behind them, the first systematic English naval strategy. He reformed the army. The third, the traditional Anglo-Saxon levy of free men obligated to fight, was reorganised so that half were always on duty while the other half were home, maintaining their farms and families. This solved a chronic problem of medieval armies, The obligation to feed yourself while on campaign meant that a prolonged mobilization destroyed the agricultural base that made the campaign possible in the first place. Alfred's reforms, imperfect as they were in execution, created something that functioned more like a standing force, and he educated his court. Alfred, who reportedly could not read Latin until his 30s, became one of the most intellectually serious kings in English history, translating works of philosophy and history into Old English, establishing schools, building a literate administrative class that could sustain the machinery of government regardless of who sat on the throne. Here is the part of the story that most people never hear. The Great Army's conquest of England didn't just nearly destroy the country. It also, in a very specific and measurable way, created it. Before the Vikings arrived, England was 4 kingdoms. After the process Alfred's successors completed, the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw over the following decades, it was 1. The West Saxon kings expanded their authority northward into territory that had never been under their control, justifying the expansion not as conquest but as liberation from Viking rule. In doing so, they built the administrative and military structures of a unified kingdom. The Viking invasion gave Alfred a crisis severe enough to force him to reform every aspect of his kingdom's governance. The reforms he made, the burhs, the naval strategy, the reorganised fyrd, the literate administration, were the foundations on which his son Edward and grandson Ethelstan built the first unified English state. There is a further irony. The Scandinavian settlers of the Danelaw, the men and women who came in the wake of the Great Army and put down roots in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, did not remain a foreign presence. They became English. Their words entered the language. Their farms are identifiable today in thousands of English place names ending in by, Thorpe, Thwaite, Pruse. When you say the words sky, window, husband, law, call, take, wrong, or happy, you are using vocabulary that entered English through the settlements of the Great Army's followers. The people who almost destroyed England became, over a generation or two, some of its most characteristic inhabitants. This is not how conquest stories are supposed to end, but it is how this one did. Alfred died in 899. His successors spent the first half of the 10th century completing the reconquest of the Danelaw, town by town, fortress by fortress. By 954, with the death of the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, a man whose nickname tells you most of what you need to know about his diplomatic style, England was, for the first time, a single kingdom under a single king. It lasted about 30 years before the Vikings came back, but that is a story for a later chapter. What matters here is the shape of what had happened. The Great Army had arrived with a clear intention, to take England. It had largely succeeded. And in succeeding, it had accidentally created the conditions under which England, for the first time, became a coherent nation rather than a collection of squabbling kingdoms. The Vikings came to England as destroyers. They left, or rather, stayed and became English, as one of its founding peoples. The men who had burned Lindisfarne would have found that very difficult to believe. But there it is, Chapter 5, Rivers of Silver, the Eastern World, and the Birth of Russia. While the western half of the Viking world was busy burning monasteries and besieging Paris, something equally consequential, and far less understood, was happening in the east. No burning churches, no terrified monks, no chronicle writers recording the horror in Latin for posterity. The east left different evidence: hoards of silver coins buried in Scandinavian soil, grave mounds along Russian rivers containing men buried with Eastern jewellery and Arabic dirhams, and the faint linguistic ghost of a word that would eventually name the largest country on earth. The story of the Vikings in the east is not a story of destruction. It is a story of commerce, colonization, and the strange, violent process by which a group of Swedish traders and warriors became the founding dynasty of Russia. It is a story that most Western history books either skip entirely or reduce to a footnote. That is a mistake. Because what happened along the river systems of Eastern Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries was, in its own way, just as world-shaping as anything that happened in England or France. It began, as so many things in Viking history begin, with the question of where the silver was. Picture the geography. From the Baltic Sea, the inland sea that Scandinavian traders had dominated for generations, there were river routes leading deep into the interior of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The Volkhov River flows south from Lake Ladoga, into Lake Ilmen. From there, portages and smaller waterways connected to the Dnieper, which flows south all the way to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. Alternatively, the Volga flows southeast toward the Caspian Sea, into the territory of the Islamic Caliphate and its extraordinary wealth. These were not obscure backwater routes, they were highways. The forests of northern Russia and Scandinavia produced the finest furs in the world: sable, ermine, beaver, marten, and the Islamic world and Byzantine Empire wanted those furs desperately. The trade flowing along these river systems in the 9th and 10th centuries was one of the great commercial networks of the medieval world, and the Scandinavians who positioned themselves at its northern end were extracting enormous wealth from it. The people who made this eastern journey were primarily from what is now Sweden, specifically from the region of Svealand, the Swedish heartland. The Finnish-speaking peoples who lived along the Baltic coast called them ruotsi, a word meaning something like the men who row. The Slavic peoples they encountered further south adapted that word. It became Rus. Russia's name comes from a Finnish word for Swedish oarsman. That fact deserves a moment to sit with. The country with the largest territory on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, takes its name from a group of Scandinavian traders who were trying to reach the silver markets of Baghdad. The first significant Scandinavian presence in the east was established at a place called Staraya Ladoga, Old Ladoga, near the southern shore of Lake Ladoga in what is now northwestern Russia. By around 750, this settlement already existed as a mixed community of Finns, Slavs, and Scandinavians. It was not a Viking conquest. It was, in the beginning, a trading post, a place where northern goods could be assembled, sorted, and dispatched south along the river system. What made Ladoga important was its position. It controlled the first major choke point on the northern river route, where the Volkhov River, the gateway to the interior, could be monitored, taxed, and defended. Whoever controlled Ladoga controlled the gateway to the eastern trade. And the Scandinavians, with their superior ships and their experience of dominating trade routes back home in the Baltic, understood the value of choke points intuitively. From Ladoga, Scandinavian traders and warriors pushed south. They established trading posts along the rivers. They extracted tribute from the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the forest zones, furs primarily, along with honey, wax, and slaves. They sold these goods further south, in markets that were, by the standards of 9th century Europe, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. The Islamic silver that flowed north along these routes transformed the Scandinavian world. The great silver hoards found across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, thousands of Arabic coins buried in the earth, sometimes in enormous quantities, are the physical record of this eastern trade. At its peak in the early 10th century, the volume of Islamic silver reaching Scandinavia through the Russian river routes was genuinely staggering. It funded the expansion of Scandinavian royal power. It built ships. It paid armies. It is not too much to say that a significant part of what made the Viking Age possible economically came not from raiding English monasteries, but from trading with Muslim merchants along Russian rivers. But, and this is important, trading is a word that covers a multitude of sins. The tribute extraction that Scandinavian leaders practiced on the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the forest zones was not a negotiated commercial arrangement. It was coercion backed by force. You paid your furs and your slaves because men with weapons had arrived and made clear that refusal was not a viable option. The Rus leaders who moved through the river systems were simultaneously merchants, tribute collectors, and military commanders, and the line between those roles was blurry at best. The slaves were a particular horror. The demand for enslaved people in the Islamic world was enormous, for domestic service, for agricultural labour, for military use. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, whose very name would eventually give the Western world its word for the institution, were a primary source of this supply. Scandinavian traders acquired them through raids on Slavic settlements or through purchase from local chieftains, and moved them south along the same river routes that carried the furs. Some went east to the Caspian and the markets of Central Asia. Some went west, through Frankish territories, to Muslim buyers in Spain and North Africa. This is not a comfortable story to tell. It is also not one that can be left out, because the slave trade was not a minor side business. It was one of the central economic activities of the early Rus network, and one of the primary ways in which enormous quantities of Islamic silver found their way to Scandinavian hands. By the middle of the 9th century, the Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe had evolved from scattered trading posts into something that looked increasingly like political organisation. The critical development was the emergence of Novgorod, the new city, on the Volkhov River, near the site of the original trading settlement of Old Ladoga. Novgorod sat at the intersection of multiple river routes, controlling access between the Baltic and the interior in a way that made it, effectively, the gateway to Russia. Whoever controlled Novgorod controlled the northern end of the entire eastern trade network. Later Russian tradition records that the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the region, exhausted by their own internal conflicts, invited a Scandinavian leader named Rurik to come and rule over them. The story is probably too tidy, the kind of narrative that later rulers used to legitimize their authority by making conquest look like invitation. But the core of it seems to be true. A Scandinavian leader established control over Novgorod in the 860s, and his dynasty would go on to rule the emerging Russian state for centuries. What is striking about the Novgorod arrangement is how quickly the Scandinavian rulers adapted to their environment. They learned the Slavic languages. They adopted Slavic naming customs. Within 2 generations, the leaders of the Rus were giving their children Slavic names rather than Norse ones. They absorbed the political structures of the Slavic world rather than imposing purely Scandinavian ones. This was not assimilation under pressure. It was deliberate, strategic adaptation by people who understood that ruling a vast, Slavic-speaking territory required speaking its language, literally and culturally. Further south, even more significant developments were unfolding. The Dnieper River, the great river that runs south through the heart of what is now Ukraine, led, eventually, to Constantinople. The Byzantine capital was, in the 9th century, probably the richest city in the world. A trading relationship with Byzantium was, for the Rus leaders who could establish it, a commercial prize of extraordinary value, and a military threat to Byzantium was an even more powerful bargaining chip. In 860, a Rus fleet appeared before the walls of Constantinople. The attack was partially repelled. Byzantine sources attribute the city's salvation to a miraculous intervention involving a relic of the Virgin Mary, which tells you something about how shocking the attack was to Byzantine observers. But the real significance of 860 was not the attack itself. It was the message it sent. The Rus could reach Constantinople. They had the ships, the navigational knowledge, and the military force to threaten the empire's capital. Byzantium drew the obvious conclusion: better to have these people as trading partners and mercenaries than as enemies. By the early 10th century, formal trading treaties had been established between Kiev, the city on the Dnieper that had become the centre of Rus political power, and Constantinople. Rus merchants had a designated quarter in Constantinople. They could trade under specific regulated conditions. And in exchange for access to Byzantine markets, Rus leaders provided something Byzantium needed desperately: military manpower. The Varangian Guard, the elite mercenary force that served Byzantine emperors, was one of the most remarkable institutions of the medieval world. Recruited primarily from Scandinavians and later from other northern peoples, they were, for several centuries, the most trusted military unit in Byzantine service. Trusted precisely because they had no local political loyalties, no family connections to the Byzantine aristocracy, no reason to shift their allegiance to one faction or another in the constant intrigues of the imperial court. The most famous Varangian guardsman in history was a Norwegian named Harald Hardrada, who served in Constantinople in the 1030s and 1040s before returning north to become King of Norway. He is the same Harald Hardrada who invaded England in September 1066, 3 weeks before William the Conqueror, and died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a story we will come to in a later chapter. The circle of Viking history, in this as in so many things, closes in unexpected ways. The relationship between the Rus and Byzantium was not purely commercial. It was also, eventually, religious. The conversion of the Rus to Christianity is one of the great hinge moments of European history, and it happened in a way that was simultaneously calculated and dramatic. The key figure was Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, who ruled from 978 to 1015. Vladimir was a pagan ruler of a partly Christianized state. His grandmother Olga had converted decades earlier, but the conversion had not become official policy. According to later Russian tradition, Vladimir sent emissaries to investigate the major religions available to him: Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, and the Eastern Christianity of Byzantium. The emissaries who went to Constantinople returned with a report that has echoed through Russian cultural memory for 1,000 years. They described attending services in the great church of Hagia Sophia and said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendour or such beauty. We only know that God dwells there among men." Whether this story is literally true or not, and it is almost certainly a later embellishment, it captures something real about why Vladimir chose Byzantine Christianity over its alternatives. The Orthodox Church came packaged with the full cultural apparatus of the most sophisticated civilization in the medieval world. Its art, its architecture, its music, its theology, its political theory of sacred kingship. For a ruler trying to build a legitimate state from a mixed population of Slavs and Scandinavian settlers, that package was extraordinarily valuable. Vladimir was baptized in 988. He married a Byzantine princess. He ordered the mass baptism of Kyiv's population in the Dnieper River. He destroyed pagan temples and began building churches. The Christianization of Russia had begun in earnest. The consequences were immense and long-lasting. Orthodox Christianity became the defining cultural institution of Russian civilization, shaping its art, its political theory, its relationship with the state, its sense of collective identity, for more than 1,000 years. The Russian Orthodox Church that exists today is the direct institutional descendant of the church Vladimir established in Kyiv in 988. The cultural DNA that Orthodox Christianity introduced into Russian life is still visible in ways that shape global politics in the 21st century. All of this, the entire trajectory of Russian civilization, begins with Swedish traders looking for a shorter route to the silver markets of the Islamic world. The Eastern story does something important to our understanding of the Viking Age as a whole. It complicates the simple narrative of raiders versus victims that the Western story can sometimes suggest. In the East, the Scandinavians were not primarily raiders. They were primarily traders, tribute extractors, and state builders. They were not operating against a civilization. They were inserting themselves into existing trade networks and political structures, adapting to local conditions with a flexibility that their Western contemporaries, staring at burning monasteries, would have found difficult to recognize. The same people, the same ships, the same fundamental combination of mobility, military capacity, and commercial intelligence. But in the East, the context was different. Fewer concentrated targets of portable wealth, more dispersed populations, longer distances, the presence of the enormous Islamic silver market that rewarded trade more richly than raiding. And so, the behaviour was different. This is the Viking story that gets lost. Not the berserker with an axe, but the merchant warrior who learned the Slavic language, married into local nobility, adjusted his trading terms to match local conditions, and ended up founding a dynasty. Not the destroyer of civilization, but, in the East at least, one of its builders. The silver that flowed north from Baghdad to Scandinavia along those Russian river routes funded the world that we recognize from the great Viking sagas. It paid for the ships. It underpinned the power of the chieftains whose ambitions drove expansion in every direction. It made the Viking Age, in an economic sense, possible. And it left behind something that none of those Swedish traders pulling their oars through the flat river country south of Lake Ladoga could possibly have imagined. The largest nation on earth, carrying in its very name the memory of the men who first opened the road. Chapter 6. The Edge of the World, Iceland, Greenland, and the First Americans. There is a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates properly. Not the courage of the battlefield, the kind that happens in a few hours of noise and blood and terror, surrounded by other men, with the momentum of the charge carrying you forward whether you want it to or not. A different kind. The courage of sailing west into open ocean, with no knowledge of what lies ahead, no certainty of land, no possibility of rescue if something goes wrong, and only the behaviour of birds and the colour of the water and the angle of the stars to suggest that you are not simply sailing off the edge of a world that, for all anyone knows, may actually have an edge. The Vikings who colonised the Atlantic islands were not running away from anything, at least not entirely. They were running towards something. The possibility of land, of freedom from the political pressures of an increasingly organised Scandinavia, of space in a world that was, for ambitious men with too many brothers and not enough inheritance, beginning to feel uncomfortably small. What they found, in the end, was more than land. They found the limit of what a pre-industrial civilization could sustain across open ocean. They found, briefly and almost accidentally, a continent. And they found, in the silence of their eventual disappearance from Greenland's western shores, one of the most haunting lessons in all of Viking history about the cost of being too rigid to adapt. Before we follow the ships west, we need to adjust our mental map. Most people, when they think about the Viking world, think east-west. Scandinavia on one side, England and France on the other, with the North Sea in between. But the Vikings themselves thought in a different geography. The North Sea was not a barrier. It was a central basin, surrounded by destinations. And to the northwest of that basin, stretching up through the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, and the Faroe Islands, was a chain of stepping stones that led, if you followed them far enough, to the edge of the known world and then, it turned out, beyond it. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, sitting north of Scotland, were among the first territories the Vikings settled outside Scandinavia. Norwegian farmers and fishermen began arriving there in the late 8th century, attracted by land that was, by Norwegian standards, genuinely good. The people who had lived there before, the Picts, the scattered remnants of post-Roman British populations, were absorbed, displaced, or simply outnumbered. By the 9th century, these islands were, culturally and linguistically, Norwegian. From Orkney and Shetland, the Faroe Islands were a manageable journey northwest. The Faroes were essentially uninhabited when the Norwegians arrived. A few Irish Christian hermits may have established communities there, but they had not stayed in large numbers. By the early 9th century, Norwegian settlers were farming the Faroe Islands' sheep-grazed hillsides and building the kind of small, tight-knit communities that would characterize Norse Atlantic settlement for the next 2 centuries. From the Faroes, on a clear day, you could almost see Iceland. Iceland was not unknown when the Norwegians began settling it in the 860s and 870s. Irish monks had been there. Scandinavian sailors had sighted it. The Irish called it Thule, the ancient name for the mysterious island at the edge of the world. But knowing a place exists and actually going there to live are very different propositions. The later Icelandic sagas, written down centuries after the settlement, but preserving older oral traditions, tell a specific story about why Norwegians left for Iceland in large numbers in the 870s. The villain of the piece is Harald Finehair, the Norwegian king credited with being the first to unify Norway under a single rule. Harald's consolidation of power, according to this tradition, squeezed out the independent chieftains who had previously operated with complete autonomy. Rather than submit to a king, they loaded their families, their livestock, their household gods, and whatever portable wealth they possessed onto ships, and sailed for the uninhabited island to the northwest. The historical reality was almost certainly more complicated. Settlement of Iceland seems to have begun before Harald's unification campaign, and many settlers likely came from the Norse colonies in Scotland, Ireland, and the Western Isles rather than directly from Norway. The sagas may have simplified a messy, multi-generational migration into a clean narrative of political exile, but the core impulse rings true. Iceland was a place to be free. What the settlers found was extraordinary. A large island, the size of England, almost entirely uninhabited, with vast grasslands suitable for cattle and sheep, rivers full of salmon, coastal waters thick with fish, forests of birch and willow along the sheltered valleys, and hot springs that heated the ground in winter. It was not hospitable by the standards of the Norwegian coast. The winters were brutal, the volcanic geology was unpredictable, the growing season was short, but it was available. Land without a lord. Care, testes, space without obligation, the dream of every farmer who had watched his sons grow up with no inheritance to give them. The settlement happened quickly. Within 60 years, roughly 870 to 930, almost all of the habitable land in Iceland had been claimed. The Norse settlers brought their agricultural practices, their social structures, and their legal traditions. They also brought, from the mixed Norse-Gaelic communities of the British Isles, a significant Celtic element, Irish and Scottish thralls and wives whose genetic contribution to Iceland's population is still detectable in modern Icelandic DNA. Iceland produced something that existed nowhere else in the medieval world, a functioning republic, without a king, without a feudal hierarchy, without a church powerful enough to dominate political life in the early centuries. The Icelanders governed themselves through a system of assemblies, things in the Norse vocabulary, culminating in the Althing, the general assembly that met every summer at a volcanic rift valley called Thingvellir. The Althing was not a democracy in the modern sense. Power was held by chieftains, Gothar, who represented their followers and whose support was necessary for any major decision. The poor had less voice than the wealthy. Women had less voice than men. The system was, by contemporary standards, profoundly unequal. But by the standards of 10th century Europe, it was remarkable. There was no king to make unilateral decisions, no standing army, no mechanism for one family to seize permanent control. Disputes were resolved by law, a remarkable body of customary law memorized and recited by a legal specialist called the Lögsagumaður, the law speaker. When Christianity arrived in Iceland around the year 1000, the conversion itself was decided by vote at the Althing, a procedure that would have been inconceivable anywhere else in medieval Christendom. This is the Iceland of the sagas, a society uniquely obsessed with law, argument, and the negotiated settlement of disputes, precisely because it had no ultimate authority to impose one. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries but describing events of the 10th and 11th, are the richest literary record of Norse life that survives. They exist because Iceland was literate. Iceland was literate because it had leisure, stability, and a tradition of valuing the spoken word. It is one of history's more improbable gifts. The Viking world's most complete self-portrait was created by the settlers of a volcanic island on the edge of the Arctic, who had gone there to escape politics and ended up inventing literature. Iceland filled up. And when Iceland filled up, the logic of Atlantic expansion had only one direction to go. Eric the Red, a Norwegian who had been outlawed from Norway for manslaughter and subsequently outlawed from Iceland for the same reason, sailed west from Iceland in the early 980s and found a large landmass covered in ice. He spent 3 years exploring its southwestern coast, where the fjords opened into valleys with actual grass, actual soil, actual conditions in which sheep and cattle could survive. When his period of outlawry expired and he returned to Iceland, he called the place Greenland. This was, depending on your perspective, either inspired marketing or straightforward description. The southwestern coast of Greenland, in the relatively warm climate of the early medieval period, was genuinely green in summer. The interior was not. The ice cap that covered most of the island's vast interior was, and remains, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But Eric wanted settlers, and Greenland sounded more appealing than iceberg. It worked. In 985 or 986, a fleet of 25 ships left Iceland for Greenland. 11 arrived. The rest turned back or were lost. Those who made it found what Eric had promised: habitable land, clean water, abundant hunting, and the possibility of a livable life on the terms that Norse settlers understood. At its peak, the Greenland Norse settlements comprised around 500 farms spread across 2 clusters of fjords in the southwestern corner of the island. They raised cattle and sheep. They hunted reindeer, seals, and polar bears. They harvested walrus ivory, a commodity of extraordinary value in medieval Europe, used for everything from chess pieces to religious art, and effectively the primary export that made Greenland economically viable. In exchange, they received from Norway and Iceland the iron, timber, grain, and other necessities that Greenland's harsh environment could not produce. For 3 centuries this worked. It was not comfortable. It was not prosperous by the standards of Norway or Iceland, but it was viable. And then, slowly and then catastrophically, it stopped being viable. The climate cooled. The pack ice extended further south, making the sea passages increasingly dangerous. The Inuit, the indigenous people of the Arctic, who had been moving eastward across the Canadian Arctic for centuries, began appearing in Greenland's northern hunting grounds, competing with the Norse hunters for the same resources. The market for walrus ivory collapsed when elephant ivory from sub-Saharan Africa began reaching European markets through new trade routes. The Norse Greenlanders faced a choice that other Arctic peoples had faced and navigated successfully: adapt or die. The Inuit had developed the technology, the clothing, the hunting techniques, and the social organization to thrive in the changing conditions. The Norse settlers had not. Bound to their cattle farming, church building, European way of life by culture and identity, and perhaps sheer stubbornness, they could not or would not make the transition. By the mid-15th century, the Greenland Norse settlements were gone. The last written record is from 1408. Archaeological evidence suggests the final decades were grim, cattle getting smaller across generations as the cold deepened, the settlers eating their dogs in the end. They died out without anyone in Europe noticing, until the silence had lasted long enough to become unmistakable. It is one of history's most melancholy endings. A civilization that had crossed an ocean, survived 3 centuries at the edge of the habitable world, and ultimately succumbed, not to dramatic catastrophe, but to the slow, grinding mismatch between who they were and what the world was becoming. But before Greenland's long decline, one of its settlers did something that the Western world would not truly understand for 5 centuries. The sagas tell 2 versions of the story, with enough overlap to suggest a real historical core. Bjarni Hergolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 985, was blown off course and sighted land to the west, forested, low-lying, nothing like Greenland. He did not land. He turned around and found his destination. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the man who had founded Greenland, heard Bjarni's story and decided to investigate. Around the year 1000, he sailed west from Greenland and found, in sequence, a land of flat stones and glaciers, a land of forests and white sand beaches, and finally a land where wild grapes grew, which he called Vinland, the land of wine. He spent a winter there. He brought timber back to wood-starved Greenland. He came home. Others followed. Thorvald Eriksson, Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought settlers with the explicit intention of establishing a permanent colony, and brought his pregnant wife Gudrid, who would give birth to a child named Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas, almost 5 centuries before Columbus. Freydis Eriksdottir, Eric the Red's fierce and morally complex daughter, who led her own expedition and whose behaviour on it was, by the saga's own account, genuinely terrible. The physical evidence for these voyages exists. At Lansor Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement dating to around 1000 CE, turf buildings, ironworking debris, a bronze cloak pin of distinctly Norse design. This is not the site of Vinland itself, most scholars now believe, but rather a base camp from which further exploration southward was conducted. The actual Vinland, where the grapes grew, was likely further south, perhaps in New England or Nova Scotia. Why did they leave? The sagas are explicit about this. The Skraelings, the Norse word for the indigenous people they encountered, carrying connotations of something like wretches or barbarians, were numerous, organised, and not interested in being colonised. The Norse settlers, cut off from reinforcement by 3,000 miles of open ocean, lacking the numbers to fight a sustained war, and unable to establish the kind of military dominance that would have allowed a permanent presence, eventually concluded that Vinland was not worth dying for. The gap between possibility and reality was, ultimately, a question of numbers. There were not enough Norse settlers in Greenland to supply a sustainable colony in North America against indigenous resistance. The entire Norse Atlantic world, from Norway to the tip of Newfoundland, was simply too thin a chain of people strung across too vast a distance. The Atlantic story is, in the end, a story about limits. The Vikings pushed further and faster than any European civilization before them. They crossed open ocean with tools that modern sailors would consider terrifyingly inadequate. They established communities at latitudes where survival required constant ingenuity and an almost reckless faith in human adaptability. They touched 3 continents, Europe, Asia through Russia, and North America, before any other civilization had managed to connect even 2. But limits are real. The Atlantic settlements were always operating at the edge of what pre-industrial societies could sustain across open water. Iceland survived because it was large enough and close enough to Europe to maintain viable connections. Greenland survived for 3 centuries because walrus ivory was valuable enough to make the connection economically worthwhile. Vinland failed because the distance was simply too great, and the resistance too strong. There is a lesson here that sits quietly underneath all the drama of longships and discovered continents. The Viking achievement was not just audacity, it was also calculation. The same commercial intelligence that sent traders down Russian rivers and raiders up French rivers was operating when Leif Erikson weighed the timber and grapes of Vinland against the distance from home and the hostility of the people, who already lived there. Sometimes the calculation said go, sometimes it said turn back. What no calculation could predict was which choices would echo through centuries and which would vanish into silence. The Norse who settled Iceland left behind a living nation of 370,000 people, a unique literary tradition and a parliamentary institution, the Althing, that has operated, with interruptions, for over 1,000 years, making it arguably the oldest parliament in the world. The Norse who settled Greenland left behind empty ruins, slowly covered by Arctic grass, discovered by archaeologists 1,200 years later. The Norse who touched North America left behind one set of excavated turf walls in Newfoundland and 500 years of mystery about what might have been, if the numbers had been different and the distance a little less impossible. The edge of the world, it turned out, was not a cliff. It was a threshold, and some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be held. Chapter 7. Knoot's Empire and the Viking Twilight. There is a story about a king sitting on a beach, commanding the tide not to come in. Most people who know it think it is a story about arrogance, a monarch so drunk on his own power that he believed he could order the ocean to obey him. That is almost exactly backwards. The king in the story is Knoot. Knoot, in the English spelling, the Danish ruler who, at his peak, controlled England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden simultaneously, making him the most powerful ruler in northern Europe in the early 11th century. And according to the original telling of the story, Knoot staged the whole beach scene deliberately to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that even the most powerful king on earth could not stop the tide, that genuine power had limits, that no human authority was absolute. It is a remarkable thing for a Viking king to say, and the fact that Knoot said it, or was remembered as saying it, tells you something important about how much the world had changed since the first longships appeared off Lindisfarne in 793. The age of the Viking as pure raider was over. What had replaced it was something more complicated, more politically sophisticated, and in many ways more consequential, the age of the Viking empire builder. And Knoot was its greatest exemplar. But to understand Knoot, we need to understand what brought him to the throne of England and what that story reveals about the final violent convulsions of the Viking Age. The 30 years of relative stability that followed Alfred the Great's victories in the late 9th century were real, but they were not permanent. England, under Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder, Ethelstan, Edgar the Peaceful, was a genuine political achievement, a unified kingdom, reasonably well governed, with a sophisticated monetary economy and a church that functioned as an effective administrative partner to the crown. It was also, by the standards of the Viking world, extremely wealthy. And wealth, as the previous century had demonstrated repeatedly, was a magnet. The raids resumed in the 980s. At first they were small, the kind of coastal strikes that had characterized the earliest Viking attacks 2 centuries before. But the political context had changed in ways that made the new raids potentially far more dangerous than the old ones. Denmark had, under Harald Bluetooth and then his son Sven Forkbeard, become a centralized, militarily capable kingdom with the organizational capacity to mount operations that dwarfed anything the fragmented warbands of the 9th century could have attempted. What the new Danish kings had that the Great Army had lacked was a state, a treasury, a bureaucracy capable of equipping and supplying large fleets, the ability to sustain military pressure over years rather than seasons. The English king facing this threat was Ethelred, later given the deeply unflattering nickname the Unready, which in Old English meant something closer to the poorly counselled, or the one who took bad advice. History has not been kind to Ethelred, and some of the unkindness is deserved. He was not a disaster as a ruler in every respect, but his response to the renewed Danish threat was characterized by a fatal inconsistency. Pay tribute when the pressure became unbearable, rebuild when the Danes withdrew, fail to use the rebuilt resources to create genuinely effective defences before the next wave arrived. The tribute payments, called danegeld in later tradition, reached sums that made the payments of the previous century look modest. £16,000 of silver in 994. 24,000 in 1002, 36,000 in 1007, 48,000 in 1012. The numbers escalate with a grim regularity that tells the story of a kingdom paying not for peace but for time, and not using the time well. In 1002, Ethelred made a decision that would trigger a chain of events leading, 14 years later, to the complete Danish conquest of England. On St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, 1002, he ordered the killing of all Danes in England. The precise scope of what followed is debated. England had a large Scandinavian population in the Danelaw, and a wholesale massacre of all of them was probably neither intended nor achieved. What did happen was a series of killings in various English towns, targeting Danes who were living there under royal protection. Among the dead, according to later sources, was Gunhild, the sister of Sven Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Whether Gunhild was actually killed is uncertain. Whether Sven believed she was killed is not. In 1003, he arrived in England with a fleet. He was not there to collect tribute. The raids that followed over the next decade were not the opportunistic strikes of independent chieftains looking for silver. They were coordinated military campaigns led by the King of Denmark in person, with the explicit objective of destroying Ethelred's capacity to resist. Towns were burned. The military machinery that Alfred had built, the burhs, the organised fyrd, was systematically dismantled. The English nobility, watching their king's response oscillate between ineffective resistance and costly surrender, began making their own calculations about which side it was safer to be on. In 1013, Sven Forkbeard led his fleet up the Humber, marched south through the Danelaw, where the Scandinavian descended population welcomed him, and effectively conquered England in a single campaign. Ethelred fled to Normandy, where his wife Emma's family ruled. England submitted to a Danish king for the first time since the era of the Great Army. Sven died in February 1014, 5 weeks after being acknowledged as king. Ethelred came back. His son Edmund, later called Ironside for reasons his campaigns would make obvious, fought a brilliant defensive campaign against Sven's son Knoot. In October 1016, Ethelred died. In November 1016, Edmund Ironside died, possibly from wounds, possibly from other causes. Knoot, at around 20 years old, found himself the uncontested king of England. He would rule it for 19 years, and those 19 years would look almost nothing like what anyone in 1016 might have predicted. Knoot's conquest of England had been brutal. His political consolidation of it was, by the standards of the era, remarkably restrained. Plier. He killed a number of the English nobles who had most actively resisted him, but far fewer than comparable conquerors of the period might have. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, a move of considerable political sophistication that simultaneously linked him to the previous English royal line, maintained the Norman connection that had given English kings a refuge, and sent an unambiguous signal that he intended to rule England as an English king, not as an occupying overlord. He issued law codes. He supported the English church generously, funding monasteries, attending councils, writing letters to the Pope in terms that positioned him squarely within the mainstream of Christian European kingship. He maintained and extended the administrative machinery that his Anglo-Saxon predecessors had developed. The royal mint, the sophisticated currency system, the network of burhs turned towns, all of it continued, largely unchanged, under Danish rule. Within a few years of his conquest, Knoot was in many respects more English than Danish in his political behaviour. He understood with a clarity that many conquerors never achieve, that you cannot rule a sophisticated kingdom by force alone. You need the cooperation of its administrative class, its church, its nobility. To get that cooperation, you need to speak their language, not just linguistically but culturally. You need to be recognisable to them as a legitimate ruler within a framework they understand. This is the context for the beach story. Knoot, staging a demonstration that royal power has limits, was not modesty for its own sake. It was political communication, a message to the English church and nobility that this Danish king understood the Christian concept of a ruler accountable to God, not simply a pagan warlord accountable to no one. It worked. By the time Knoot added Norway and parts of Sweden to England and Denmark in the 1020s, he was ruling what looked, in outline, like the kind of northern empire that several Scandinavian kings had dreamed of, but none had achieved. He attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor in Rome in 1027, negotiated trading privileges for English and Danish merchants, and wrote home to his subjects with the kind of confident, self-aware political language of a ruler who understood that he sat at the centre of a genuinely significant power. It lasted as long as he did. Knut died in 1035, aged somewhere in his late 30s, young even by medieval standards. His empire immediately began to disintegrate. His two sons ruled England in sequence, dying within a few years of each other. In 1042, the English nobles recalled the old West Saxon dynasty. Ethelred's son Edward, raised in Normandy, known to history as the Confessor, to the English throne. The Danish moment was over. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 without a direct heir. What followed was one of those compressed historical moments where several decades of accumulated tension releases simultaneously, changing everything in the space of a few months. Three men had credible claims to the English throne. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl, was elected king by the English nobility and crowned immediately. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, the same man who had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard a generation earlier, believed that an old agreement between his predecessor and Knut's son gave him a legitimate claim to England. And William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of the Viking Rollo, now thoroughly French in culture and language, claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath to support that promise. Harold Hardrada moved first. In September 1066, he sailed into the Humber estuary with a fleet of 300 ships and a force that contemporaries estimated at somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 men. He was accompanied, in an act of dynastic politics that would have impressed Knut, by Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig, who had invited the Norwegian king to England in the first place. The invasion went initially well. Harold Hardrada defeated a northern English force at the Battle of Gate Fulford on September 20th, and the city of York submitted to him shortly afterward. Then Harold Godwinson arrived. The English king had been waiting in the south, watching for William's fleet across the Channel. When news of the Norwegian landing reached him, he made one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history, moving his army nearly 200 miles in 4 days, covering ground at a pace that his soldiers must have found extraordinary and his enemies found impossible. On the 25th of September 1066, Harold's army appeared before the Viking forces at Stamford Bridge near York. Harold Hardrada and Tostig had not expected an engagement that day. Many of their men had left their armour with the ships, and the attack caught them partially unprepared. The battle that followed was brutal and decisive. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army, one of the largest forces assembled in the Viking world in that generation, was destroyed so thoroughly that the survivors needed only 24 ships, of the original 300, to carry them home. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and it lasted, from landing to catastrophic defeat, exactly 5 days. Harold Godwinson had won a stunning victory. His army was exhausted, strung out along the roads of northern England, its casualties replaced by militia levies of uncertain quality. And then the news arrived, from the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on September 28th, 3 days after Stamford Bridge. What followed, the march south, the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, Harold's death, the Norman conquest, is so familiar as a piece of English history that it is easy to forget its Viking dimension. William of Normandy was, by culture and language, French, but his duchy had been founded by the Viking Rollo less than 2 centuries earlier. His court still had Norse names alongside French ones. The military aristocracy he led into England contained men who were, genealogically, the great-great-grandchildren of the same wave of Scandinavian expansion that had produced Knut, the Great Army, and the dynasty of Novgorod. The Norman conquest was, in one reading, the last act of the Viking Age, the final transformation of a Viking territorial claim into a permanent political reality, this time conducted by men so thoroughly assimilated into French culture that they no longer thought of themselves as Norse at all. The Viking had completed his metamorphosis. He had arrived in northern France as a raider, and he had become a duke. And now his descendant was becoming the King of England, speaking French, building castles in stone, transforming the country with an efficiency and thoroughness that even Knut's 19-year reign had not achieved. After 1066, the Viking Age did not end dramatically. It wound down, There were further Norwegian expeditions to Britain. Magnus Barefoot raided the Western Isles in the early 12th century, reasserting Norwegian claims to Orkney and the Hebrides. But these were the last embers of something that had burned for nearly 300 years. The political conditions that had made Viking expansion possible were changing in ways that could not be reversed. Scandinavia itself was transforming. The three kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, were consolidating around royal dynasties, Christian churches, and administrative structures that looked increasingly like the feudal monarchies of Western Europe. The conversion to Christianity had profound implications for the culture of raiding. It was considerably harder to justify attacking fellow Christians than it had been to raid the monasteries of a religion you didn't share. Church networks across Europe created diplomatic and commercial connections that offered alternatives to violence. The ships were still there, the seamanship was still there, but the specific combination of political fragmentation, economic desperation, and military opportunity that had driven the great expansions of the 9th and 10th centuries was gone. What replaced it was trade. Norwegian merchants were exporting dried cod to European markets by the early 12th century, a commodity that would eventually become one of the most important foodstuffs of the medieval world, feeding the growing cities of Europe through the lean winter months. The same ships that had carried warriors to England now carried fish to the continent. The same commercial intelligence that had mapped Europe's monastery wealth now mapped its market demands. The transformation was not complete, and it was not peaceful everywhere, but its direction was clear. The Viking world was becoming the medieval world. The raider was becoming the merchant. The warlord was becoming the king. Knoot, sitting on his beach, telling the tide it could not be ordered back, was not just performing a lesson in political humility. He was, without knowing it, describing the Viking Age itself. 300 years of expansion, violence, settlement, and transformation. A tide that had come in with a force that reshaped the coastlines of half a continent, and now, slowly, inevitably, going out. Chapter 8. What the Storm Left Behind, the Viking Legacy. Here is a question worth sitting with in the dark, just before you fall asleep. When you woke up this morning, you probably looked out a window. You may have felt angry about something, or happy about something else. Perhaps your husband or your wife was still sleeping. You checked the sky for weather. You called someone. You took something from a shelf. You thought about the law, or about what was wrong with a situation, or about how things might thrive if handled differently. Every italicized word in that paragraph is a Viking word. Not a word that came from Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. Not a word that came from French, the language of the Norman conquerors. A word that came from the Norse settlers of England, the Danelaw farmers, the traders of York and Lincoln, the men and women who arrived in the wake of the Great Army and never left. The most ordinary words in the English language: window, sky, husband, happy, angry, wrong, take, call, law, thrive, die, ill. These are not exotic borrowings, the kind of specialized vocabulary that academic languages adopt from each other. These are the words you use when you're not thinking about language at all. The words that live so deep in English that removing them would not change the language, it would destroy it. That is one measure of the Viking legacy. Not the most dramatic measure, not the most politically significant, but perhaps the most intimate. Because it means that every English speaker alive today is, in the most literal sense, still speaking the language that Viking settlers shaped. The storm passed. The words remained. But the words are only the beginning. Let us take stock of what the Viking Age actually produced. England. The unified English kingdom that Alfred the Great's successors completed in the 10th century was made possible, paradoxically, by the great army that had tried to destroy it. Before the Vikings arrived, there were 4 kingdoms. The Viking conquest of 3 of them created both the necessity and the justification for West Saxon expansion northward, giving the English monarchy a rationale for unification, liberation from Danish rule, that it could not have manufactured any other way. The Danelaw settlers became English. The English became, over time, a people whose language, law, and culture bore the permanent imprint of both peoples. Normandy. The duchy that Rollo received in 911 as payment for defending the Seine against other Vikings, became, within a century, one of the most dynamic political and military forces in medieval Europe. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a Viking downstream effect, a Scandinavian territorial claim finally redeemed by men who no longer thought of themselves as Scandinavian. But the energy, the organisational capacity, the willingness to cross water and remake political landscapes by force, these were inheritances from a Norse tradition, even when the men exercising them wore French armour and spoke French words. Russia. The trading network the Swedish Rus established along the eastern river routes became the skeleton of a state. Kiev, founded and ruled by Scandinavian-descended dynasties, became the capital of Kievan Rus, the political and cultural ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. Vladimir's conversion to Orthodox Christianity in 988, driven in part by his Rus dynasty's relationship with Byzantium, set the entire trajectory of Eastern European civilization. Its art, its architecture, its political theology, its relationship between church and state. The Russian Orthodox Church exists today in an unbroken institutional line because a Swedish trader's great-great-grandson decided that Hagia Sophia was the most beautiful building he had ever seen. Iceland. The most improbable of Viking legacies is also, in some ways, the most enduring. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930, is the oldest parliament in the world that has operated continuously. Iceland itself, with a population of less than 400,000 people, produces more books per capita than any other country on earth. A cultural inheritance, perhaps, from a society that preserved its history in oral literature and then, when literacy arrived, transferred that tradition to the written page with extraordinary energy. The Icelandic sagas are the most complete literary record of Norse culture that survives anywhere. Without Iceland, we would know vastly less about the Viking world than we do. These are not footnotes. These are the foundations of the modern world. The Christianization of Scandinavia was not simply a religious event. It was a political transformation with consequences that reshaped everything. The process was gradual and, in places, genuinely coercive. The Norwegian kings Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, the latter later venerated as Saint Olaf, used methods that ranged from persuasion to outright force in imposing Christianity on their subjects. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who converted around 960, used his acceptance of Christianity partly as a diplomatic tool to position Denmark within the mainstream of European politics, where the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were powers too significant to ignore. But beneath the political calculations, the conversion had profound cultural consequences. The Old Norse religious world was not simply replaced, it was transformed. The warrior ethic, the emphasis on courage, loyalty, martial excellence, and a death that would be remembered, did not disappear when the gods of Asgard were officially retired. It was absorbed into a Christian framework that had its own tradition of warrior saints, crusading ideology, and the concept of a just war fought in God's name. The Viking warrior who had sought glory in Valhalla could, in a Christian context, seek it in the service of a righteous king, or, eventually, on crusade. What Christianity brought to Scandinavia, practically and irreversibly, was literacy. The church needed literate administrators, literate priests, literate rulers. It brought with it the Latin alphabet, the tradition of written law, the record-keeping apparatus of an institutional bureaucracy. The runic writing system that Scandinavians had used for centuries was adapted for limited, specific purposes but could not compete with the full communicative power of an alphabetic writing system supported by the resources of the church. Literacy, once established, was not neutral. It recorded the laws, it preserved the histories, it enabled the correspondence between kings that made international diplomacy possible. And in Iceland, uniquely, it preserved the oral literature of the pagan Norse world in written form. The sagas, the Eddi poems, the mythology of Odin and Thor and Loki and Ragnarok, at precisely the historical moment when that tradition would otherwise have been lost. We know what the Vikings believed, how they lived, and how they understood their own world, primarily because the Christian monks of Iceland wrote it down. The faith that replaced the old religion also saved its memory. That is a more layered irony than most religious history allows itself to contain. One of the most persistent myths about the Vikings is that they were destroyers of cities. The reality is that they were, in a significant number of cases, founders of them. Dublin. The Viking longfort, established in 841, became a trading city, then a major medieval port, then the capital of Ireland, The city's street plan in its oldest neighbourhood still reflects the layout of the Norse settlement. The name Dublin itself, Dublin in Irish, Black Pool, preserves the geography of the original Norse harbour. Medieval Dublin was a Viking city that happened to be located in Ireland. York. The city the Romans had built as Eboracum, the Anglo-Saxons had called Eoforwic, the Vikings renamed Jorvik, and we call York, was transformed under Danish rule into one of the most economically active cities in northern Europe. Archaeological excavations in the Coppergate area of York, the street whose name preserves the Old Norse word for a cupmaker's quarter, revealed a 10th century Viking city of extraordinary commercial vitality. Leather workers, metal smiths, textile producers, jewellers, amber carvers, an entire urban economy operating at a level of sophistication that challenged older assumptions about Viking culture as purely martial. Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, Cork. The Irish coastal cities founded as Viking bases in the 9th century became, over subsequent centuries, the primary ports of medieval Ireland. The Irish economy's integration with the broader European trading world happened through these Norse-founded harbour towns. Ireland without the Viking settlements would have been a different country economically, more closed, more rural, less connected to the commercial networks that drove medieval European growth. Novgorod, Kyiv. The great cities of early Russia were Viking foundations or Viking transformations of existing settlements positioned at strategic points in the river trading system. They became, in subsequent centuries, the urban cores around which Russian civilization organized itself. Kyiv's designation as the mother of Russian cities in later tradition reflects the actual historical role of the Rus trading network in creating the urban geography of Eastern Europe. This is a difficult legacy to fit into the standard Viking narrative. The man with the axe and the burning monastery does not easily become the urban planner and the merchant prince, but the historical record insists on the complication. There is a version of this story, the version most often told, in which the Vikings are observed entirely from the outside. The monks record the raids. The Frankish chroniclers describe the tribute payments. The Anglo-Saxon scribe notes the battle. The Viking appears as a force of nature, an external pressure, something that happened to the settled world. But the Vikings had an inside. They had a literature, a mythology, a set of values so coherent and so carefully preserved that we can still read their poetry 1,000 years later and hear the voice of a civilization that understood itself with unusual clarity. The Norse conception of fate, word, in the Old English that absorbed it, was not passive resignation. It was the understanding that certain things are fixed and certain things are not, and that the measure of a person is what they do in the space between necessity and choice. The heroes of the sagas do not prevail because the gods favour them. They prevail, or fail, because of who they are. Character is destiny. In the Norse world, more completely than in almost any other ancient literary tradition, this produced a particular kind of courage, not the courage of the man who believes God will protect him, or the courage of the man who doesn't fully understand the danger he's in. The courage of the man who looks at the danger clearly, calculates that it probably cannot be survived, and goes forward anyway, because the alternative, turning back, living small, accepting diminishment, is worse than death. You can see this in the archaeological record. The grave goods buried with Viking warriors were not just practical supplies for the afterlife. They were statements of identity. The sword, the shield, the carefully made tools, these were a person saying, "This is who I was. This is how I chose to live. Let the evidence speak." And in a way, it still does. The evidence has been speaking for 12 centuries. The grave mounds, the runic stones, the buried hoards of Arabic silver, the outline of ancient ship timbers preserved in the soil of Norwegian fjords, the names of English villages, the genetic signature in Icelandic DNA, the street plan of Dublin, the church of Hagia Sophia, still standing in Istanbul, which converted a Rus prince and through him an entire civilization. Every one of these things is a continuation of a conversation that began when someone in 8th century Scandinavia looked at the sea, made a calculation, and decided to go. Here is the last thing the Viking Age offers us, and perhaps the most important one. It is a mirror. The standard reading of the Vikings, violent outsiders disrupting a peaceful, stable civilization, is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because the world the Vikings disrupted was not peaceful, The Frankish Empire was already tearing itself apart in civil war before the first Viking ship appeared on the Seine. The English kingdoms were already fighting each other before the Great Army landed. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were already in conflict before the Rus traders arrived. The Vikings did not create instability, they exploited it. And the difference between those two things is significant, because it means the Viking Age was not simply the story of a violent culture attacking a peaceful one. It was the story of a violent era in which Scandinavian mobility, adaptability, and commercial intelligence allowed one group of people to insert themselves into the conflicts of every other group, simultaneously as enemies, allies, traders, settlers, and founders. The societies that absorbed the Viking impact were not destroyed by it. They were, in most cases, transformed by it, made more complex, more connected, more dynamic. The English language is richer for the Norse influx. The English state is more unified, paradoxically, because of the crisis the Vikings created. The Russian state exists, in part, because Swedish traders needed a route to the silver of the Islamic world. This is not a story with heroes and villains in the places the traditional narrative puts them. It is a story about what happens when mobile, adaptable people encounter the fracture lines in established civilizations and move along those lines with intelligence and force. It is a story about how destruction and creation are not always opposites, how the same force that burns a monastery can found a city, how the same people who terrorize a coast can transform a language. And it is a story, ultimately, about what endures. The ships are gone, the chieftains are gone. The gods of Asgard, Odin with his ravens, Thor with his hammer, the trickster Loki unmaking the world, have retreated into myth and, from myth, into popular culture, which is its own kind of immortality. But the window is still there. The sky, the lore, the sense of a world where character is destiny, and the sea is a road, and the horizon is not a wall but an invitation. The storm came from the north, and it lasted 300 years, and what it left behind is, in ways both obvious and invisible, the world you woke up to this morning. Sleep well,